right, folks, here's one that you might be interested in, especially for my geopolitical folks. Coming soon to the United Nations, Chinese leadership and authoritarian values. As Washington steps back, Beijing will take charge. For many years, the annual meeting of the United Nations General Assembly, UNGA, in September was a centerpiece of U.S. global leadership. President Barack Obama's administration, for example, used the occasion to galvanize international action on issues such as climate change and refugee settlement. But when presidents and prime ministers gather in New York starting this week, they will do so under the auspices of an organization that is undergoing a profound transformation. The United States has let go of the wheel, and Beijing stands poised to take hold of it. Eager to expand its influence on the world stage in many ways that serve its interests, China has placed considerable resources behind an effort to present its leadership at the UN as a nimbler, more dynamic alternative to that of the United States. In the past few years alone, the Chinese Communist Party, CCP, has positioned its officials to head up for the UN's 15 specialized agencies, while the United States leads only one. It has also advanced more than 24 memorandums of understanding in support of its Belt and Road Initiative, BRI, and mobilized a consortium of illiberal states to tamp down international criticism of its repression of ethnic Uyghurs in Xinjiang province. The United States has responded to China's rising profile in only a piecemeal fashion, in part because Washington has been busy recalibrating its own relationship with the international body. The administration of President Donald Trump has passed through numerous ambassadors to the UN in a short time, while unilaterally withdrawing the United States from certain UN agencies and repudiating multilateral institutions more broadly. With China seeking to steer the United Nations away from its founding principles, however, the United States can't afford to sit back. A China-dominated UN would only lead to the steady erosion of the U.S. values and interests in matters that range from non-proliferation to sustainable development. If the Trump administration is serious about competing strategically with China, it will have to step up its game on this highest international stage. For decades, China's role at the United Nations was largely one of spoiler. Through the international body, Beijing aimed primarily to stymie the efforts of the United States and other democratic powers to impose a liberal vision on the world. Deng Xiaoping, the former leader of China, gave voice to the worldview behind these efforts in a 1974 address to the United Nations General Assembly. He denounced the United States' vain pursuit of world hegemony and cautioned against the establishment of spheres of influence by any country. But as China's power and influence grew, its approach to international organizations evolved. Today, under President Xi Jinping, China has left behind the defensive posture that once defined its roles at the United Nations. In a speech last year, Xi called for China to take an active part in leading the reform of the global governance system. Beijing is using the United Nations as a platform for legitimizing authoritarian rule. China is doubling down on the United Nations at a time of U.S. retrenchment. In 2011, for instance, the United States cut off $80 million in annual funding to the UN Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, UNESCO, about 22% of its entire budget. China raced to fill the void, pledging millions of dollars in extra budgetary support for education programs. Beijing has increased its monetary contributions to the United Nations fivefold in the past decade, touting itself in state-sponsored narratives as a champion of multilateralism. China's investment has earned it clout, something that Beijing could have used just to protect itself from criticism over the policies in Xinjiang and Tibet, and to isolate Taiwan. But the CCP has advanced a more ambitious agenda, defending beleaguered autocrats in Venezuela and Syria, and promoting the view that respect for sovereignty should allow governments to disavow individuality and minority claims in the name of internal security. China has used the UN's Human Rights Council, the very body tasked with holding human rights violators to account, to warp and denude the concept of universal values, arguing that each country may choose its own model of human rights protection in the context of national circumstances. In short, Beijing is using the United Nations as a platform legitimizing authoritarian rule. China has contributed more than money to the United Nations in recent years. The country has made a systematic effort to fill the organization's leadership posts with Communist Party officials. Chinese now head more than a quarter of the UN specialized agencies, including the Food and Agriculture Organization, the International Telecommunications Union, and the International Civil Aviation Administration, and the Industrial Development Organization. And the Chinese government continues to recruit more and higher quality servants to work at the UN. In return for the money, expertise, and personnel it provides, Beijing seeks the UN's endorsement for its foreign policy initiatives, most notably Belt and Road. As Xi Jinping's marquee initiative, BRI has won accolades for helping provide needed infrastructure to developing countries, but it has also garnered substantial criticism for falling short of international standards of financial viability, environmental protection, and labor rights. Beijing has used the UN to shore up the project's legitimacy and international support. China has tried to make the BRI indistinguishable from the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, which focuses on poverty mitigation and environmental sustainability. The BRI serves the purposes and principles of the Charter of the United Nations, says Liu Jianmin, formerly of China's Foreign Ministry, and now UN Undersecretary for Economic and Social Affairs. Even UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres has touted the initiative's benefits as the UN throws its full-throated support behind BRI with little inquiry into its risks and limitations. Despite China's efforts, many UN member states remain skeptical about Beijing's leadership in global affairs. A recent Pew Research poll found that only 19% of respondents preferred for China rather than the United States to lead the world. But a future shaped by the values and interests of the CCP is fast arising, and the opportunity to forestall it is now. Washington should stave off China's efforts to dilute liberal values in the UN system, particularly around the protection of human rights. Together with like-minded nations, the United States should focus on preventing China from inserting seemingly innocuous ideological terms into UN documents, for example. Win-win cooperation, community of shared future for mankind, and the democratization of international relations. Such terms deliberately degrade consensus around universal human rights, and U.S. officials should disseminate a publicly available reference list of them. Explain how they are used to narrowly advance Beijing's interests at the expense of established norms and values. At the same time, the United States should call for UN leadership, including the Secretary General, to speak out more forcefully against China's most egregious human rights abuses. Michelle Bachelet, UN's High Commissioner for Human Rights, has set an example by going on the record to criticize the deeply disturbing allegations of large-scale arbitrary detentions of Uyghurs. A future shaped by the values and interests of the CCP is fast arriving, and the opportunity to forestall it is now. If you don't believe that China is running the world, believe it now. Just one more example. And this article basically is telling you or begging the United States to take the reins back so that white values and white supremacy can still hold on to what it has left. Like she said, a future shaped by values and interests of the CCP is fast arriving, and the opportunity to forestall it is now. She didn't say stop it, forestall it. In other words, slow it down. But everything they do, it actually accelerates it. And this basically comes on the heels of Macron's speech, telling you the exact same thing, that the liberal Western order is probably over. Even amongst its own liberal states is probably over. The world is changing. Liberalism is only like a 200-year-old idea. It's not a 200,000-year-old idea. It's a very new idea, and they've had problems with it from the very beginning. So is the liberal experiment over with? Possibly not. I think that it will be integrated into all nations. You can't get rid of it because people have seen it and people are used to it. Look at the riots in Hong Kong right now. That's liberalism versus authoritarianism. Even China's not as authoritarian as it used to be. Neither is Russia or any other country, because those days are gone, because the average man has more power. You can't force people to do something anymore. You have to negotiate with them, and that's the essence of liberalism. The negotiation between the leaders and the folks and the followers. That's not going away because the environment says it's not going away. So authoritarianism is not what it used to be. It's not like the czars or like the emperor of China or the emperor of Japan or even the kings and queens of Europe. Those days are gone. So the liberalism will not die, in my opinion. It just won't be white liberalism. It won't be white domination of the planet anymore. That day is gone, and that boat has sailed. The boat probably has sailed and is sinking as we speak. But this is just one more example of the idea of white supremacy as it has been defined by Neely Fuller. That day's over. And newer actors are actually rising upon the scene. But hell, 10, 11 years ago, there was a guy that was, I think he was at Harvard. He actually gave that speech about that day being over. The thing is, we're just now realizing it now. Before, we could only imagine it because it was just being whispered amongst elite circles. Now we can plainly see it in everyday headlines and everyday newspapers. What's going on in the Gulf is one more example of white power is still there, but white supremacy is gone. So, it's a new paradigm. Better get used to it. For those people that don't believe it, hell, go out and prove that it does, that it still exists, that it still has the same clout that it used to have. Convince me. Anyway, I've held enough of your time. This is BGS out, and I will see you guys on the next one. Peace.